I think I will get us started. I'm mindful of the time and I'm appreciative of everyone who's joined us. My name is Kim Strom. I'm director of the Office of Ethics and Policy here at UNC-Chapel Hill. And I'm also the Smith-Thiemann Professor of Ethics and Practice at the School of Social Work here at Carolina. This event tonight is actually funded in part because of the generosity of Smith-Thiemann and the folks who have helped direct his wishes, particularly Dan Wilson and Lisa Ignacek. And so I want to thank them and always be mindful of Smith's commitment to integrity and to the power of social work done right. The event is also sponsored by the Office of Ethics and Policy at Carolina, and it's the centerpiece of our Global Ethics Month activities. Want to thank our undergraduate interns who've worked very hard on all of our activities for this month, and acknowledge also my colleagues, Jen Daniil and Matt Teal, for their work in putting this together. And also a shout out to Phil Kaufman from the School of Social Work, whose IT assistance has been crucial since the inception of this event. We're very fortunate to have Eric Muller with us this evening. Eric's a distinguished professor at the School of Law here at Carolina, and he will introduce our speaker and facilitate the Q&A. Some of you may remember Eric's talk last year was a centerpiece of last year's Global Ethics Month events, and the video of that talk is available on the Ethics and Policy website. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Eric and to our esteemed guest speaker, Yusun Park.
Thank you, Kim, and good afternoon or evening, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Kim. I appreciate it. I'm very happy to have been asked to moderate this event. The book that is the subject of the talk, the research that is the subject of the talk, is work that I've been very enthusiastic about and is very important, I think, and also quite timely. My job is to introduce Dr. Park. She is an associate professor in the School for Social Work at Smith College, and she is the editor-in-chief of Social Work's only feminist journal, which is called Ophelia, if I'm pronouncing that correct. I hope I am. Her scholarship is informed by post-structuralist theories of discourse and methods of inquiry, and it focuses in and around the areas of immigration. She pursues two overlapping lines of interest. First, social work's history with immigrants and immigration, and also the study of contemporary issues that relate to immigrants and immigration. Her examination of the current and past discourses of the profession have reached for and inspired formulations of social work research, education, and practice, contesting the status quo and enlivening the profession's aspirations for social justice. She's working now on a new book, which is a critical history of social work's involvement in the early 20th century Americanization movement and its implication for today's social work and its engagement with newcomers. I'm going to encourage all of you out there in participant land to, as things occur to you, as questions or comments occur to you, please use the little Q&A box. I think we're all familiar with Zoom at this point, so please use the little Q&A box, which I will be keeping a close eye on, and that way we'll make sure that when we get a little bit later in the afternoon to the Q&A period, your questions and comments will be all teed up and ready to go. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to all of you Dr. Yusun Park.
Thank you so much for all of that. Thank you for coming to this talk in the middle of a Monday afternoon. And I'm going to attempt now to share my screen, which is always a little bit of suspenseful of an event, even though I've done it a million times now. So here we go. Sorry, that did not work. Do you see it? Okay. So thank you for inviting me. And the focus of my book is going to be the content of this book that I published last year called Facilitating Injustice. But in order to do this, I'm going to weave in and out of telling you a little bit about immigration history to the US, that is, and then talking about the contents of this book, and really trying to focus on how does this make sense for today's social work. And I think many of you are probably not social workers, but I'm going to focus my talk on social work, but with the understanding that the questions that I'm asking, I think has relevance for many, many different professional settings and different disciplines. So let me begin there, and then just to explain what I do. The bulk of my work is what I call critical disciplinary history. And what that does is it's a reflexive study of the profession's past actions. And I do this in order to inform current and hopefully future practices within social work. So following Foucault, it is a history of the present is what I do. And what that history of the present means is that it studies the past to eliminate present day dilemmas, and that it examines forces that have constituted and continue to shape not only social work, but the society in which social work is embedded. In order to identify the fault lines and assess their implications for future actions, I think critical disciplinary history is necessary for every profession if you hope to do at least the kind of future work that doesn't repeat the mistakes of the past. And just to warn you that what I do is discourse analysis. So there's going to be a lot of text on these slides, which I know you're not supposed to do, but I wanted to share as much as possible the words of the people who actually wrote them back in the day. And what I will be doing is critiquing social work. And to quote the Marxist clinical social worker, Bertha Capon Reynolds, who is now considered one of the foremothers of social work, but was actually fired by Smith College, my institution, for being a Marxist, I think of myself as a loyal critic. I criticize social work because I think it is a profession and a discipline worth examining. So let me move on. As I go through these slides and talk to you, I hope, which is a very odd experience, by the way, because I can't see any of you and have no sense of a reaction to anything I'm saying. But I wanted to really put this out there, that the idea that the interval that we assert between ourselves and the past may be much, much, much less than we assume. So our sense that somehow we have gotten past some of the problems of the past and that we have developed past certain ideas and ideals of the past, I think may not be quite true. This is just a random, I did a random search of the internet. And this I think I found when back a couple of months ago from the journal Nature. And I just want to point out the image that it's showing. For an article that was titled, "When Will the Coronavirus Peak?" I would like you to notice the preponderance of Asians in this photo and really think about why. And how does this relate to the talk I'm about to give? Is that really the past? I don't think is the past. The problematization of immigrant bodies and certain types of immigrant groups and the consideration and the conceptualization of those bodies as types of contaminants lodged in the body American and an alien body. I think this is an idea that still continues to have force in the US. And from my perspective as a student of immigration history, I think one of the most frightening things about the truly, truly awful, mean-spirited, draconian policies that have passed in the past 3 years is their lack of originality. We keep repeating the same ideas that we actually put aside for a while and are now going back to. So many of the pitiless measures the federal government is enacting today are modernized reiterations of bigoted practices, especially from the 1920s. And in my view, knowing our history and knowing our immigration history at least allows us to spend a lot of time, it allows us to stop spending a lot of time being outraged or being surprised, and helps us to begin to anticipate what may come. Whether it is COVID or the detention of migrants at our border, or what's happening in our urban centers, I think that knowledge of our history allows us to plan. And so as I speak, I would ask you to hold this question in your minds. How should we understand our ethics and responsibilities in these troubled times? I'm going to be speaking about another period, World War II, where obviously things were difficult, but how do we use that knowledge, and how do we think about all those ideas and apply to them to our present today? And in our ethics, when I wrote this, I meant social work ethics, but I think we can think about this more broadly and think about what are the ethics and responsibility that we have as citizens and participants in this society today. So I'm going to turn now to the history of the removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans and the contents of the book. It was called The Greatest Planned and Controlled Migration in Our History. And I'd like you to take note of the word migration, because in this history, and even when you read this history today, there's so much euphemisms that are thrown about. So I think it's usually talked about as the internment. And that's a very complicated word, because there were actually internment camps. But the internment as an umbrella term for all this has really been decried as a type of euphemism that we need to stop using. So I'm going to be using the word camps, concentration camps, American concentration camps, and the term concentration camps to talk about the places in which the Japanese Americans were incarcerated was used during the time that this happened. It was actually an official terminology. And many historians actually refer to this as well. Oh, sorry, I'm going backwards here. So this migration, controlled migration, is forced removal of an entire population from the coastal regions, the West Coast of the United States. It involved approximately 120,000 people who were incarcerated, 2/3 of them who were US-born citizens, the Nisei and the Sansei. And there were 219 voluntary residents who were incarcerated along with them, and they were mostly non-Japanese spouses and children. There were about 6,000 births in these camps, and then about 2,000 deaths. I started studying this a long time ago when I was doing my dissertation. I came across here's the cover of the book just so you can see. Well, before I go there, social workers were involved in each step of the process. And I came across a single article in a journal, a really top-ranking journal in social work called Social Service Review, that talked about the fact that social workers were involved. And I was really, truly shocked, because I had never read about this. I had never heard about it. I'd never read about it. And in no class during my MSW program had I ever heard that social workers were involved in this entire set of procedures. And so I went to each of my professors and asked them, and none of them had heard about it either. And many of them had heard about the fact that there was such a thing that had happened, the phenomenon itself, but that social workers were involved was something completely new to them. And the only person who had actually heard about this was a professor of mine who ended up being my dissertation chair, Professor Hideki Anthony Ishizaka, who had been born in one of these camps. So I made it a vow that someday I would study this. And so many years later, I started doing deep research into this and found that an article that I wrote on the topic in 2008 was the first time any social worker had looked at this material or had commented on it since the 1940s when it actually happened. But social workers were involved in each step of the process. The removal process from the West Coast, and many people don't know this, but there was actually a really brief period, about a month, of a period called voluntary evacuation. Again, please note the euphemism. And then that transition into what's called a controlled evacuation, or the forced removal. And then an incarceration period in two different settings. First, assembly centers, which were temporary, and then relocation centers, which are the camps that are longer term, where people stayed in 2-3 years, and those were often called concentration camps. But I will go through all this again, but I just wanted to show you for now what the actual span of the history was. And then a third part, which is often talked about as relocation or resettlement. And this was also a type of forced scattering of the population, which I'll talk about later. And social workers were involved in all parts of these processes. They were, as you can see from the cover of my book, there were social welfare departments in each of the camps, which were staffed by trained social workers. So why did this happen? How did this removal of an entire population, and the entire population being that although people were not, Japanese Americans were not removed from the middle of the country or the East Coast, the majority of them were already living on the West Coast. So it ended up being, over 90% of the population. So why did this happen? At the time, the major percent of the rural Japanese, according to Donald Young, who was a sociologist in the 1937, wrote this book, wrote this article. According to Young, it appears to have been their success as farmers, as wage workers and as farmers. And a majority of the Japanese Americans were on the West Coast were farmers. And their success was probably exaggerated by the magnifying power of their striking racial visibility. They were a very, very small population, but a powerfully visible population because they were so successful. 45.2% were farmers, but 30 to 35% of the value of all commercial crops grown in California were grown by Japanese American farmers, which is quite an astounding number. So lots of competition. And that they were responsible for growing 50 to 90% of specialty crops like snap beans, celery, strawberries, and other things that were sold out of trucks. Truck farming is another way to talk about them. So part of it was economic competition, but economic competition isn't enough to actually explain their removal. It was a matter of race and racism. This is from a piece of work that was written in 1943, but explains the Army's thinking on this. In the war in which we are now engaged, racial affinities are not severed by migration. So even though they live in the US, it doesn't mean that changes Japanese racial affinities. The Japanese race is an enemy race. And while many second and third generation, Nisei and Sansei, Japanese born on the United States soil, possessed of United States citizenship, have become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. And this, the last sentence, seems to me very military in its absolute, in its thinking. The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken. So the United States Army, which was responsible for the removal process, really considered, and I could spend an entire semester on this one paragraph alone because of the ways in which race and loyalty are conflated. and that race can be actually considered something that is an overarching symbol for whether you belong to a country or not, right? And the racial strains that don't become changed, and how, whether you are culturally American or have become assimilated, that doesn't matter. But I won't spend an entire semester on this, but, and then Senator James D. Phelan, who was a senator, a California senator, who said in 1921 that this is actually a shorter version of saying what happened up top. We must preserve the soil for the Caucasian race. That competition, and a racialized competition, was what the problem was. And I think most scholars would agree that this is the reason why people were removed. And this idea that Japanese represented a racial problem was also a really kind of common way of understanding race relations back then. And so this, what I'll show you, is from an anthropologist. And I'm taking this slide out of an article from a social work conference. And the racial-cultural problems was laid out this way. So A.A. Goldenweiser, who was actually a student of Franz Boas, wrote that the major racial cultural problem of the US is the Negro and the Oriental, and in particular the Japanese. And more recently, the Eastern European Jews who were coming into the country in large numbers. And the minor problems, so the influx of Italians, Greeks, Bohemians, and Slavs, again, the Eastern and Southern Europeans who were coming into the country in large numbers back then. And then the immigrant English, the French, the German, Scandinavians, they represented no problems whatsoever because they care for themselves so well. And that in that way, their presence in this country cannot be said to constitute a problem. And I show you this to talk about the hierarchy and what the conceptualization, the taxonomy of racial problems was, and where the Japanese fit in to this issue. So given that context, I'm going to turn now to, and turn aside from the removal and the incarceration, and go back to, talk a little bit about immigration history. So I don't know how many of you have studied immigration history at all, but in my thinking, immigration policies can be, especially prior to 1965, can be divided into two different strands. One is what I'm going to show you now, individual exclusion or characterological exclusion categories that apply to European immigrants, white immigrants. And they are things like, starting in 1875, when the first federal immigration law was passed, foreign convicts and prostitutes. 1882, persons likely to become a public charge. This is the famous LPC clause, which actually still stays on the books and is causing lots of problems, and was a really huge barriers for Jews trying to flee fascist Europe during World War II. And then things like contractual labor. And then the categories actually just keep growing, and I'm just showing you some of them. All idiots, insane persons, paupers, persons likely to become public charges, people suffering from a loathsome or dangerous disease. This contagious disease also stays on the books today. In 2010, HIV/AIDS was taken off finally. Criminal behavior, so on and so on and so forth. But the list is really long, and this is not when it stops, but I wanted to show you these because, as you can see, these are things that are applied to individuals. You look at a person and look at their history and look at their character and look at where they are and think, okay, this looks like this is a person who doesn't have any money. An idiot being actually a technical term for mental health problems. But for a different population, for non-white populations, there's a different set of laws. that I call categorical exclusion. And they tended to, at the time, really target Asian populations because Asians were a really visible minority group coming into the country. So 1875 is when it begins with the Page Act, actually. But 1882 is the first categorical exclusion. It's the Chinese Exclusion Act, which suspends the entry of Chinese laborers into the US for 10 years. But then this act just expands and continues. The act to prohibit the coming of Chinese into the US, the Act of April 29, 1902, which extends the Chinese Exclusion Act indefinitely. The Asiatic Barred Zone Act, which is a really interesting one, passed in 1917, which excludes all people from what's called the Asia-Pacific Triangle that Congress simply drew on a map. And this is where the term API, Asian Pacific Islanders, comes from. And then finally, in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which permanently barred entry to any alien ineligible to citizenship. And I'll talk more about why Asian immigrants are ineligible for citizenship. But I hope that you can see the difference. These are categorical exclusions of a population. And ultimately, the 1924 Act is a bar that is race-based. Very, very different from the individual adjudication laws, right? So the 1924 Act, which barred all aliens ineligible to become US citizens, has a lot to do with this, this quote I'm showing you, which is this is an immigration scholar who argues that immigration control was a key institution through which the negotiation of whiteness occurred. And why was whiteness an important element for to be negotiated? And that has to do with a lot of things, obviously, but one of the most important factors in this was the Naturalization Act of 1790, which, among other things, established that the right to naturalization, that is to become a US citizen, even though you weren't born in the US, so that naturalization process, the right to naturalization was restricted to free white persons. And so you can see then why it was important to establish who was a white person. And I'm going to show you a series of Supreme Court cases that really adjudicated this. But these were, if you were in my class, I'd be asking you right now, when was this rescinded? And in my experience, most people don't know this because US education doesn't cover this kind of information. Rescinded in 1870 for Africans and people of African descent. And this is really important. The Act of July 1870, July 14th, 1870, extended naturalization rights. And I want you to remember this, extended naturalization rights to aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent. And then 1924 for Native Americans, which seems completely illogical, but is a matter of fact. Native Americans were not considered US citizens prior to this time. 1943 for people of Chinese descent. And you can think about what's happening globally at this time. So this a lot to do with geopolitics and the war that's happening in Asia. And then 1946 for Filipino and Indian descent, because post-war Philippines and India, and this has to do with Cold War, because both the Philippines and India are flirting a little bit with whether it's going to, which way it's going to go, towards the USSR, towards the US. And then it didn't end for 1952, until 1952 for all others, meaning that when Japanese Americans were being incarcerated for being aliens who are actually incapable of being loyal to the US, they were barred by US naturalization law from ever becoming anything other than alien. And for Asians, the right of citizenship by being born on US soil, birthright citizenship, as it's commonly known, was also something that had to get argued. This is a photo of Mr. Wong Kim Ark, who was born in San Francisco. And he was born on Sacramento Street in San Francisco, if you know where that is, which is the heart of Chinatown. He went to China to go visit his relatives and came back and was entered the country just fine. He went again and tried to come back into the country when was stopped at the port of San Francisco and held in detention. And so he actually argued his way all the way to the Supreme Court. And the case hinged on the interpretation of the 14th Amendment, which ratified in 1868 guaranteed citizenship and equal and civil legal rights to emancipated slaves, right, in the wake of the Civil War. And what it was really arguing was the jurisdiction. And to put it simply, what the US lawyers argued was that because his parents were ineligible to become US citizens, not being born on the soil, by bloodline, they were subjects of the emperors of China, and by bloodline, he too, even though he was born in the US, Mr. Wong Kim Ark, was a Chinese person and a subject of the emperor of China, rather than somebody who had US citizenship. And the US attorney arguing the case wrote that Wong Kim Ark has been at all times, by reason of his race, once again, his race, language, color, and dress, a Chinese person under the jurisdiction of the Emperor of China, rather than being a US citizen. So this went up to the Supreme Court. And I would like you to really, I would invite you to just think for a moment about what it might take for somebody like him to actually pursue a case like this all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the kind of courage it took to do this. So for once, actually, the Supreme Court said, yes, if you are born on the soil, you are a US citizen, regardless of your race. And this has been a landmark case, which is actually really useful today, because Congress, every year, every Congress tries to take this birthright citizenship away, even still. And today, it's not about the Chinese, but mostly about the children of undocumented immigrants. Who have American US born children. So the next case I'm going to show you. So what this means is that Asians were, the only way that Asians could actually have citizenship was through birth on the soil. And the next case I'm going to show you is the case of Mr. Takao Ozawa. In November of 1922, this is a photo of him. I've never been able to find another photo of him. But the case really hinged on, so he argued that what free white meant was that one is not a slave, and he's not, and that whiteness was really about assimilatability. So he said, I'm assimilated. I'm an assimilated person, born in Japan, but he had lived in California for most of his life. And he argued that he didn't speak Japanese at home. He's married a woman who didn't speak Japanese. His children didn't speak Japanese. They ate American food. In all ways, he lived his life as an American. And the Supreme Court said, well, it's a complicated case, but I'm going to boil it down to this, really, that what whiteness meant, what white meant was Caucasian. And denied his case, arguing that then Japanese Americans cannot become naturalized US citizens. So then the next case that came along is in 1923, but please note that the first case, Takao Ozawa, was November, and this was in February, so only 3 months apart. And this case, Mr. Bhagat Singh Thind argued that he was a high caste Hindu from India, born in Punjab, came to the US in 1913. He had actually served as a soldier in World War I and was honorably discharged. He had applied for citizenship and was granted it in the lower courts, and then taken it away again. So this case was interesting because what his lawyers were arguing is that being a high caste Hindu, any anthropologist, ethnologist, the term was at the time, would acknowledge that they speak an Indo-Aryan language, and they trace their ancestry back to the region of Mount Caucasus, where the original Aryans come from. So he was arguing, in fact, that he was Caucasian. What do you think happened here? What was the decision? Oops, sorry. So let me show you here. In the Ozawa case, the determination was that white persons really meant Caucasian. He was clearly of a case, a race which is not Caucasian and did not belong in the Caucasian category. And in the Tin case, what the same justices argued was that the mere ability on the part of an applicant for naturalization to establish a line of descent all the way to that Caucasian ancestor to the region of Mount Caucasus did not really solve anything, because Caucasian was a conventional word of much flexibility, and this is a direct quote, and that what free white persons meant was that really, if you walk down the street and ask 10 people, does this guy look like a Caucasian, that Mr. Tin would not pass that bar. So his case was also denied. Why did it matter that they could not become US citizens? Well, you can imagine lots of things. I mean, with the election about to happen in a few days, you can see that you cannot vote. But those are, there are many, many other effects of this. And I wanted to just show you a handful of them. So the California Foreign Miners Tax, 1852, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in 1848, and lots of people rushed to California to actually mine the rivers for gold. And a lot of Chinese who had been imported for labor ended up going into the mine work. So California passed a 3-month tax at a time when $6 was the average monthly income. So this was quite a lot of money. And what scholars calculate, and that this was only applied, this tax only applied to people who were ineligible to become US citizens. And scholars calculate that about 5 million was collected from during that time through this tax, and that 98% of it was paid by the Chinese miners. And that constituted half the state income of California in a span of 20 years. Homestead Act of 1862, if any of you have seen the movie with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, where they're running around and putting stakes down, claiming land, provided that any adult citizen or intended citizen who had never borne arms against the US could claim 160 acres of government land. But this was eligible only for people who were eligible to become US citizens, and ineligible thus to Asians who were ineligible for naturalization. The alien land laws first passed in California in 1913 and then went to 15 different states. It was a really interesting law. And this also, if you've ever read the book Snow Falling on Cedars or saw the movie, then that's what the pivotal thing in that book was about the alien land laws. What it said was that you could not, if you were a person ineligible to become a US citizen, and remember, it is a racial bar, you could not own land or rent land for, first it said, the lease provision said for more than 3 years. So you could lease land, but not beyond 3 years. And that had to do with the fact that the kind of farming that the Japanese were really good at, for instance, strawberries, took 3 years to mature so that you could harvest them. So this was not taken off the books until 1952. The last one I'll show you is the Cable Act of 1922, and this is also a complicated act, which I find shockingly that no one has ever heard of. What the Cable Act of 1922 did was to establish for the first time in US law that US-born women, so women of US citizenship, did not lose their citizenship by marriage. So it's called the Married Women's Independent Citizenship Act. And what it did was, there was a 1907 act called the Expatriation Act, which established something that had been happening anyway, but it actually put into law that if a US-born woman with citizenship thus married a foreign man, her citizenship would automatically, insofar as the US was concerned, become that of her husband. So women's citizenship was considered derivative to their husbands. And so lots of women, without even knowing it, actually lost their citizenship by marrying men who were not US citizens. And so the Cable Act established that if you had lost your, so that would not happen anymore after this, but that also that if you had lost your citizenship prior to 1922 by marrying somebody who was not a US citizen, that you could regain it through naturalization. Except if you remember the 1790 Naturalization Act, which said that only free whites could become US citizens, the naturalization was not eligible for Asian women, if that makes any sense. So white women who lost their citizenship could regain their US citizenship through naturalization. An Asian woman who was born on US soil and thus was a US citizen, married somebody who did not have US citizenship, thus lost it, could not gain it back, because having lost the protection of that birthright citizenship, she was rendered a racialized person who was ineligible to become a US citizen. I wish I could ask you to whether you had any questions, but I'm going to simply move on and trust that you will keep your questions for later. So what the Cable Act, and much of this I hope can show you, is I think the greatest fear was, the term that was used a lot was racial amalgamation. And this quote that I'm showing you by Chester Rowell from The Survey, which was a social work periodical at the time, says no matter how completely their grandchildren might be assimilated economically and culturally, they would still be distinguishable physically, and that distinction, being hereditary, would last forever. So mixing races, racial amalgamation was the big fear. And that what I'm trying to really establish here is that the metaphor of the melting pot, which is used a lot about immigration to the US, was never intended to signify an open stock pot that welcomed everyone. The ingredients that was welcomed to actually go into the pot was very specific. Racialized populations were not welcome to be melted into that pot. So that is the background. That's the context, and that is the racial background, the racialization context in which the war starts. So the start of war, December 1941, as you all know, begins with Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And so now I'm going to go back into this history of incarceration, removal and incarceration. So within 24 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, about 1,000 Japanese aliens, meaning the Issei, the first generation immigrants who were not allowed to become a US citizen at this time, had been locked up. FBI sweeps and arrests are happening, and they are sent to Department of Justice internment camps. And they're actually called internment camps, so that's the correct use of the word internment. And then in February, Executive Order 9066 comes along, which authorizes the military to exclude civilians from any area, any military area without trial or hearing. And this is what starts the emptying, the clearing of the West Coast. And this authorizes the removal of the Japanese. But the executive order actually did not specify Japanese Americans, though they were the only group to be imprisoned as a result of it in total, meaning there were lots and lots and lots of Italians and Germans living in the US at the time, meaning Italian nationals and German nationals without US citizenship, as well as their children and grandchildren. But that those populations were never imprisoned en masse like this. And immediately banks were frozen and mutual aid societies were non-functioning. Japanese Americans were fired from jobs, from civil service, from the military. They couldn't get insurance. Their funds were frozen everywhere. A curfew was set up. And this is when social work first gets involved into in this set of circumstances. Prior to this time, social workers had nearly zero contact with Japanese Americans. And I can tell you more about that if you are interested, but I'll not get into it now. The social work perspective on this removal was this, that social workers said we're not in favor of indiscriminate evacuation. Again, take note of that word evacuation, a removal of citizens or non-citizens from this area for the sole reason of nationality or race. So we don't like this, is what social workers said. These are quotes from the American Association of Social Workers, which is the precursor to what's today is the National Association of Social Workers. But there's always a but here. The only warranty, the only circumstances under which we will accept the procedures of general removal would be the certification by qualified military or police authority that it was a military necessity that was required for public safety. So this is what the official social work word on the topic was. And it may sound reasonable if you didn't know that the military stance on this was absolutely common knowledge at the time. And I want you to think back to that quote I showed you about the racialization of loyalty, the military perspective on this. So the social workers put out this perspective knowing absolutely that the military, according to the military, that this was going to happen. So it was a purely performative statement that they're putting out. And so here, actually put it here again. This is what I showed you before, but I just wanted to remind you that this Army perspective was a well-known phenomenon. So the social workers weren't confused about, so they weren't saying, oh, let's wait to see what the Army thinks, the military thinks. This was already something that they knew beforehand. So then a period of voluntary evacuation happens. And I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but it was funded voluntary evacuation, meaning there was, for about a month, the military said to the Japanese Americans living on the coast, why don't you move inland and get out of these coastal regions? And so through the Federal Security Agency, and the Social Security boards, the Bureau of Public Assistance, which is part of the Social Security Board, which is part of the Federal Security Agency, the government set up what was called the Alien Assistance Service to give money, this was means tested, for people who wanted to voluntarily move. Only about 9,000 moved. And the small number has to do with the fact that it wasn't that easy for farmers to actually just, take up everything and move inland. So a lot of people did not have the kind of circumstances in life where easy removal could be done. And only, interestingly, 140 people applied for aid. Again, because government aid was not something that the Japanese Americans were very familiar with or had much contact with. And one of the most frequent tasks, social workers who had been brought in to do this alien assistance services. They kept records. And one of the most common things were asked of them was to direct Caucasians to Little Tokyo area so they could buy reduced priced merchandise, that the fire sales that were happening because the Japanese Americans had to sell everything and go. And they often had about a week's notice. And the history books tend to say it's about a week's notice, but in reality, it was never a full week. And oftentimes you'd get notified within 2 days that you had to move. So people had to sell everything and give away everything. So what a lot of social workers had to do was to direct people wanting to go to these fire sales. So that didn't last very long because no one was moving. So then the military changed its tactic and went to what's called a controlled evacuation or forced removal. And for this, again, social workers were involved, and social workers from state and county offices, about 300, more than 300 in California alone were asked to come and work here. So the California State Department of Welfare took their best social workers and lent them to the Bureau of Public Affairs to run this. And the controlled evacuation, the social workers worked under the aegis of the Social Security Board, Public Assistance Bureau. And what their job was to provide financial assistance and other services on an emergency basis to people. And where they did it was in these control stations. And so the military set up what's called the Wartime Civil Control Administration to run this. And there were 123 control stations, and I'll show you photos of them in a minute. 87 in California and the others in the other states, 2 in Arizona, 10 in Oregon, and 24 in Washington State. And this is where, once you saw that poster as a Japanese American that said, you know, you have to report for removal, where you would go to actually register the control stations. And every single Japanese person who was removed went through social workers who did the initial intake and interviewing. 48 service offices, that was sort of, that's not important, that's the control stations headquarters. So intake for incarceration, this is what social workers did at those control stations. I'll talk about, and here's a quote from one of the people who worked at those. If ever there was an opportunity for social workers to use their wit, sound judgment, and social work skills, this was it. The varied and concentrated forms of problems at this station were tremendous. So social workers talked to every family and registered them. Each family head was carefully questioned, and one of the main jobs to figure out who's in the family, how many people are there, and where were they going to go. And one of the main jobs of the social workers was interpreting the evacuation. And this is a really interesting term, because what it's saying is that what social workers had to do was to explain to the people who were getting forcibly removed why this was happening. And they were relying on social workers to actually tell a good tale. This was a necessity. This was one of the ways in which you're going to show your loyalty to the country, and so on and so forth. So to put a spin on it so that it was acceptable. And then to work through exemptions and deferments, which I'll talk about. Social workers also did lots of things like arrange weddings, rush expectant mothers to hospitals, console lots of people who were very upset. And the case number that was assigned to each family by a social worker. And if you've ever seen photos of people who are getting removed, they have these tags on them with numbers. They're like luggage tags. That number that the social worker assigned to your family followed you through the entirety of this experience. And the spin, the interpreting the evacuation, I think the social workers write about at the time who are working in these camps, they write about it as we were reassuring the Japanese Americans so that, you know, they weren't really upset or they were not scared by this. But in my view, what they were doing was actually doing their best to create a compliant population who wouldn't actually do a whole lot of protesting. So for whose benefit was this interpreting the evacuation done, is my question. So here's one photo of a control station in San Francisco, another in Visalia, California, social workers working and the Japanese Americans giving information, as you can see. One of the things that the Japanese Americans really feared was family separation. Here's a quote from a woman named Florence Pagati, who was a social worker, a Californian social worker. The Japanese seemed stoical, resigned, and little given to emotion, except under the threat of family separation. And she remarked that it was most interesting to see how these people cling to their families and relatives, even to the degrees of cousins. They all want to be together. And she found this very odd. So one of the things to think about is only families were allowed to go to the same camp. So in order to not be separated, you had to be able to prove that you were family. And one of the things that worked here was that the social work definition of what constituted family and what the Japanese American believed constituted family was very different. I'm realizing I'm speaking very slowly, so I'm going to move a little bit faster. So mixed race exemptions are some of the most interesting cases that the social workers talked about. They called it the most interesting. They're complicated cases. So I want to show you just really quickly these mixed race exemptions. In the beginning of this removal process, anyone who had 1/16 Japanese blood was forced to be removed. And after a while, the military came up with some exemption categories. And I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but I'll show you, just point out a couple of things about this, because what it shows you is, this is, again, you could do an entire semester of classes on this slide alone, because the intersectionality of race and gender and our notions of what culture is works really, is really interesting here. Because so if you're a Japanese woman, a Japanese wife, and if you're children who could show that somehow you were not Japanese, altogether Japanese, too Japanese by culture, by language, and belonging, then you could be exempted. But in no way, if you're a Japanese man or somebody who actually was not considered. So here's a good one: Japanese unemancipated children who are being reared by Caucasian foster parents. So this notion of families with who are untainted by Japaneseness in ways, who could be exempted. So social workers made these determinations and found them very difficult to do. Institutional cases were other things that the social workers had to do, which were actually quite difficult also, because exempted from removal were institutional cases. And this is a good example of one. A parent age 79, brain tumor paralysis. And this is the direct quote from the records. And what this meant was that anybody who was in hospital or had a communicable disease or was in jail, actually, did not have to be removed. But social workers thought of these as really good exemptions. So this was a thing that was a good thing. But everyone knew that none of the institutions, hospitals or otherwise, wanted any Japanese inmates of any kind. So what families had to do in this case, so think about yourself as children of this person, 79-year-old person with a brain tumor. You were leaving this parent behind, not knowing whether you would ever see them again, whether how long you'd be away for, knowing that they were going into the care of people who did not want to care for Japanese Americans. So these are really heart-wrenching cases for everybody. There's another family that I won't really mention. There's a photo of the removal that's happening. It was this was the first removal, actually, of 45 families from Bainbridge Island in Seattle, going onto a train to go off to a camp. And where did they go originally? So once they reported for removal, they were sent off to what were called civilian assembly centers. And there are many of them, but 15, depending on how you count them, 15 to 17 of them along the coast. And they were mostly in places like racetracks, and in Seattle, it was the Puyallup Fairgrounds. So most people were locked up in, housed in quarters that were meant for animals. And scholars have commented that, you know, there were other possibilities, and that they were sent to these places was not by accident. So the lodgings were not very comfortable, as you can imagine. Here's people getting sent on trains again. with the soldiers looking on. And this is one photo from 10 Foreign Assembly Center in California. And so this is what the quarters, the assembly centers look like. There was no social services set up in these camps because they were temporary camps. But then they were sent off after a few months to what's called relocation centers. And this is what in common parlance is known as internment camps. But in official language, they were called relocation camps centers and relocation camps or concentration camps. And there were 10 of them. And they were in some of the most, the worst real estate in the country. The weather was terrible. The two locations that you see in Arizona were on Indian reservations, established against the will of the Indian reservation, people who lived on the Indian reservations, the tribal councils. And they're relatively isolated, and you see all the way over here in Arkansas. So this is where the bulk of them spent a great deal of time. Heart Mountain Relocation Camp, this is a painting by Estelle Ishigo, who was locked up there. And this is a really famous photograph that you've seen, I'm sure, of Manzanar in California. Quickly, social work in the camps, ill-planned, underfunded, poorly staffed, and inconsistently administered. And as I was writing that, I was thinking, probably not that different from social work today in lots of places. But something to know is that no system of aid or services was developed well until the end of 1942, months and months after people started moving in and living in these camps. And that there was a huge difficulty in recruiting trained social workers for these camps. There was an overall shortage of social workers all over the country, but because of where they were, and a lot of social workers were really unwilling to work with Japanese Americans, and they were also unwilling to go live in these places, which was at the end of the earth. There was huge difficulty in recruiting them. And there are rules specifically established in the camps to prevent social interactions between the Caucasians and inmates. And the Caucasians, the staff who worked in these camps were often referred to in the official language as just the Caucasians. And there was a huge problem that the Japanese Americans were fully aware of, which was the condescending attitudes of so many of the Caucasian staff members. There were lots of problems. And social workers did everything, again, everything from arranging marriages to organizing funerals. But I wanted to just show you just this one case, just to show you that the kind of complicated mess that this went into. The case of Mrs. K, who's an Issei mother, a Japanese immigrant woman with 4 children, aged 5 to 11. Husband was institutionalized in a state insane asylum in California, meaning he was left behind. So she was a single mom, and she was on county welfare. This is very unusual for Japanese Americans, until abruptly she was dropped from the rolls after Pearl Harbor. So she was already impoverished coming into the camps. And she arrived in Tule Lake Camp in California in 1942 and began work as I think she worked in the cafeteria for $12 a month, which was, there was set wages, and this was the lowest of the set wages, $12 a month. And in October, applied for financial aid because she could not make ends meet, because despite what people might think, they were expensive places to live. You had to pay for everything aside from basic food and lodging. So you had to pay for toothpaste, soap, toilet paper, everything that you can imagine. In October 1952, she applied for aid, but she was determined to be ineligible because she was owed $60 in pay from working for that $12 a month, even though no one got paid in that camp until well into 1943. So even though no one was getting paid and she hadn't gotten paid a penny, she was considered, she was deemed ineligible for welfare because she was technically making money. So social workers made these determinations and did the aid, doling out the aid in complicated circumstances, certainly, but with a whole lot of reluctance. So finally, let me talk a little bit about relocation, because the resettlement was one of the final elements of this. So it actually goes against common sense, but almost as soon as the Japanese Americans were locked up, the WRA, the War Relocation Authority who ran the camps, was intent on sending them back out and wanted to send them back out into the middle of the country or to the East Coast. So they began this, what's called the resettlement program, an all-out relocation program, trying to really strong arm people to leave the camps. And it was inaugurated in October 1942, almost as soon as most people are moved in the summer of 1942. So by the fall of 1942, there was a push out of the camps. And how they were imagining this resettlement was to discourage the concentration of reformulating ethnic enclaves. So the idea was that the Japanese, their concentration on the West Coast was what was actually responsible for their removal. And so that if they could be widely scattered and really thinly placed in different places, they would become integrated with the American majority more rapidly and fully. And so if you really think backwards from this, what they're saying is that it was the Japanese Americans' own fault for conglomerating and living in concentration, even though they weren't allowed to actually live in places. So to scatter them and to scatter them thinly so that nobody would notice was the plan. The Japanese Americans living in the camps did not want to do this. Resettlement is a fighting word, was what somebody wrote about this. They had come, the Issei, the immigrant Japanese had come and were really quickly, and through this process had become really impoverished. And to push them back out into a hostile world was something that the Japanese Americans did not want to do. And that the hostility toward evacuated people and opposition to their return was really serious everywhere. There were incidents of violence and lots of laws passed, policies passed in different places to prevent them from coming. And so it was a scary world that you were being forced out into with absolutely no money, and many of them didn't speak English in the middle of a war. So many people are reluctant to go out, but social work interpretation of that, which is what I really want to talk about, is it was not what you might imagine. What social workers really talked about was that the Japanese had developed new habits of idleness, and that they had developed dependency to aid. And so this is a really a good quote. Surrounding the center, the concentration camp, was a fence that closed out freedom, but it also closed out worry, pain, and struggle for survival. The Japanese, in hostile competitiveness from the outside, institutional psychology had developed out of the security derived from center living, from living in the concentration camps, and was probably the most significant reason for the resistant attitude towards leaving. So the Japanese Americans did not want to leave because they had become too dependent and were too comfortable, was the social work conceptualization of this. Again, construction of dependency was, I'm going to move fast through this because we're running out of time. So one of the things that social workers did within the camps was start a program of Americanization. And it was done through group work, which is a particular form of social work for those of you who are not in social work. And what happened there was that there were deliberate planning of group activities to encourage people to become more American. with the idea that the more they become American, the more likely were they to actually want to go out, and it would prepare them to successfully integrate into American communities. So what they did was to emphasize American activities. Baseball, social dancing was another, and things like that. And to cut off funding and de-emphasize things like judo, any Japanese language programs, and so on. And there was a great fear. And what social workers were working against was this, what they considered the de-Americanization of Japanese American children. And the YWCA was actually, which was present in every one of these camps, was really, really instrumental in doing this group work process. So ultimately, I'm coming to the end here. Coming to the end, I'm going to skip this one, sorry. Ultimately, at the end of all this, when the camps closed, and many people were actually forced out of the camps precipitously, the rewriting of this history was to really think about this as the greatest thing that ever happened to the Japanese American people. Robert Cousins, who was the assistant director of the War Relocation Authority overseeing the camps, this was an interview done with him, and he said they were happy. They were all located in 3 states before that, living in, ethnic enclaves, which were very not good. But having the government's forced removal and incarceration of them created then a much happier population. After the war, they came back to live like the general population. They lived as Japanese before. They came back living a life similar to the American people. They liked hamburgers all of a sudden instead of sukiyaki and lots of other things. And they were now scattered all over and were part of US society, was this idea. So again, the YWCA, this is a quote from them, "Our goal is the integration of persons of Japanese ancestry," just to show you that social workers thought similarly, not the removal, the incarceration and the resettlement was a channel of permanent advantage for the Japanese Americans, and a triumphant example of successful assimilation of a population which had been a problem before. Again, this is a similar statement, so I won't show you that. And so there's a lot of congratulatory sentiment among the social workers about the splendid part in the program played by the social workers, that without social workers experienced in dealing with human beings faced with problems, Japanese Americans would have suffered far more than they actually did in this experience. And having done a great deal of research on this project, I really considered this issue. Would social workers would have done better, would have suffered more without the social workers there? And I'm a little torn about this, because I think that in the final recounting, it is somebody else would have done the job, and it is definitely possible that untrained non-social workers would have done it worse. But I think there is also no way of getting out of the fact that in doing this work, social work enacted and legitimized the bigoted policies of racial profiling of an entire population. And I think both of those things are true. So in the final recounting, how should we understand social work's involvement is a question I'd like for us to think about. Perry Sundquist, who was one of the people who worked in the control stations where people came in to register at the very beginning. He was in his daytime job, he was a social worker for the California State Department of Social Welfare, and he was a supervisor. He said, "The use of trained social workers enabled a difficult job to be done as decently as possible." And I think also, again, this is a sentence that we could apply to today's social work. But what I thought all the way through writing this book and to its end was that what I wish social workers had done was to really push the boundaries of what was decent, not simply do a bad job as decently as possible, but really argue to expand the possibilities of what we as social workers see as decency. And in my study, nobody did this. No social workers did this. Other people did. No social workers actually came out and opposed the process, and no social workers actually tried to rework and transform this idea of what is decent social work. I will end there, but I want to just show you this NASW Code of Ethics, and to really then show you, talk about, invite you to talk about what is our responsibility today. So this is one part of the NASW Code of Ethics, National Association of Social Workers, which says that we cannot practice, condone, facilitate, or collaborate with any form of discrimination. And just one last thing I wanted to mention was that last year I read an article in JAMA, of all things, where 3 MDs wrote an article talking about detention camps, where children who were removed from families in the border camps today are housed. And they asked, given our Hippocratic oath, which says, I will not use my medical knowledge to violate human rights and civil liberties, very much similar to this code of ethics. They asked, should we be working in these detention camps or in these carceral settings? And what really struck me about this article was that social work wasn't asking the same question, even though we have a very, very similar code of ethics on this. So how should we understand our ethics and responsibilities? And I will end there by showing you this photo. On the left is a Japanese American child from the war. And this tag is the tag I was talking about, which has his family number on it. And this is a child at the border today. So my apologies for talking really fast through this at the end. I don't know where I slowed down, but I took a lot more time than I thought. So I will end there and entertain some questions. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen.
Thank you, Yusun, for that fascinating talk. And you kind of took my breath away with those last 2 images next to each other. That was quite striking. So folks, this is a moment when you can hop into the Q&A section and type away to your heart's content, and we will get those passed directly along to Dr. Park for response. We have a little while here to work with. I wanted to kick things off, if I might, by asking a question. It has to do with gender. So one of the things that's been striking to me as I've looked in a very parallel inquiry at the lawyers who worked in these camps is that you get a sort of sideways view into how heavily the War Relocation Authority's power structure, you know, that ran the camps, how often they turned to the community welfare section for assistance in, you know, all of the day-to-day kinds of problems that prisoners were running into. And, you know, very, very often the community welfare person was a woman, and was often really the highest ranked woman in the power structure. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts at all about that, you know, just the idea that this was, for all of its many, many problems, the presence of social workers in the system was both an opportunity for women that would not have otherwise have been present, and also whether it might have, that itself might have had some influence on the way in which the camps were administered.
It's an interesting question. I never thought about the question of gender insofar as social workers were concerned. I mean, there are lots of men working as social workers, and yeah, I think it's at a time when social work had sort of gotten its foothold, right, in government work, because the Social Security Board had been, and Social Security Act and all of that had become an entree into government work. So I think there were both men and women involved in this work. And they were, I mean, I actually don't know what the breakdown is about the women. So I'm not going to be able to give you a really intelligent answer on this.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I will tell you though, one thing is, I got an, oh, no, it's okay. I got an email from the niece of a woman who is really high up in Social Security and that I write about. And she wrote me and said, oh my God, all this time I've been thinking my aunt was like this really heroic woman because she had reached a really high position in the Social Security Board, which is very unusual at the time, right? And she had never married. And so the niece was somebody who had been very close to her. And so she said, now I'm thinking like, you know, she was a woman who worked in a concentration, she made this concentration camp possible. So I had this really interesting back and forth with her saying, no, I think, you know, for her, your aunt to have gone up the ladder like this, she must have been a remarkable woman.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what she did, a lot of people did at the time. So it had, so I don't know where gender works into it, but I mean, if I could talk a little bit about the makeup of social welfare offices in the camps, because they had so few social workers who they could get to come and work there, they ended up hiring a lot of NICE workers. So there were a lot of young college age people, Japanese Americans who are working in these offices, and they were at loggerheads with the actually trained social workers, because what the Japanese Americans saw as as a good outcome for their clients was often considered unprofessional by the social workers. So the Japanese American workers would want to, you know, why do we need to, that person that I showed you who didn't get any aid because she technically had money coming in, what they would do is go into the lockers and actually get stuff just to give to her and not put it on the books. And sort of go around the system, because what they were, so there's very interesting dynamics. And I think the women, the women social workers that I'm mostly thinking about that were the most interesting were the YWCA workers who came to the camps, who didn't actually live in the camps, but came and constantly visited the camps and ran programs. But they ran programs which were really useful to a lot of women in the camps, but again, they were all run from a very, very specific perspective, which came out of what solid womanhood was a middle class white vision of what being a good white person, a good person was, right? Yeah. So they ran programs that had to do with how to brighten up your surroundings, right? So how to decorate using scraps. They had you know, or how to train to be a secretary, but you know, but that white middle class values were absolutely promulgated through their work. Is something that works all the way through. So yeah, I'm sorry, I can't really answer your question about
maybe we can correspond about it offline.
Yeah, hopefully I sidetracked you enough. So
there's a very interesting question from Rex Rempel in the Q&A.
He was a former student of mine.
Do you see any likeness between social work with Japanese Americans during that period and social work assistance with law enforcement today?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because I mean, that is the question. I mean, I wish that we could actually have, maybe you and I could have a discussion about this, and maybe Kim could jump in as well. But yeah, I mean, that is the question. So when I'm asking, so how does this relate, right? How does this history, what does this tell us, and what can it tell us about these troubled times? You know, what I'm talking about is carceral social work, right? And carceral social work is alive and well today. So yeah, I think the parallels are everywhere. So, and I think we can ask the same question. So is it better that social workers go along, right? When something happens, I know lots of communities are already doing this. You know, social workers are riding along with the first responders to go and respond in circumstances. And is that better? Perhaps it's better. Should social workers be involved in this? And in looking at this, what happened during World War II, what nobody did, I mean, actually what I did was I actually looked at all social work organizations today. I looked at everything that the NASW put out, the CSWE put out, and all these organizations that have to do with social work put out. And all of them say the typical NASW statement on detention camps for the migrants, for the immigrants down in the southern border. What they say is that this is terrible. We should not be taking children away. We should not be locking people up. Here's the list of volunteer places that you can go and volunteer your services. None of them are actually entertaining that question that the JAMA article entertained, which is, should we be doing this? What if we said no? What if we as a profession just came out and said, no, we're not doing this. We should not do this, right? But, and the same question I think applies to policing and also other carceral work that we're doing. And as I said, I'm not really sure what the answer is, but that we do not even begin to have a conversation about it. How will we ever actually do anything different if we can't actually entertain that question? Why aren't we having conferences that are centered on this question, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So here's another question. This is from Mimi Chapman of our School of Social Work here. When you say that there were few social workers that could be persuaded to work in the camps, was that a form of silent protest? And that maybe Mimi says this might be wishful thinking on her part.
Possibly. I think, yeah, I mean, I actually really looked hard. And went back to lots of sources to see if I could find anything where some social workers would say, no, this is terrible. We're not getting involved. I'm not going to get involved. And I never did find anything. But, you know, marginalized discourses are by definition difficult to find, right? Because they're marginalized. So it's possible that people did. But what I saw evidence of more is people who said that they were actually afraid to work in these camps. And even if you did work in the camps, you wouldn't tell your friends that you actually worked in the camps. So a lot of the social workers did not live in the camps themselves, and they wouldn't want to, if they were in a social situation with other people, they didn't want to tell them that they worked in the camps because there was so much accusation of social work coddling of the Japanese Americans. And so I think it goes the other way. The only, I have no evidence that this actually happened. And there were people, teachers actually in the camps. I don't know, Eric, if you've come across the examples of Quaker teachers who came out and said, no, especially during the one prime example is when they were doing the, in the camps, when they were doing the loyalty registration. So the inmates had to all take this loyalty test. And many teachers came out and said, no, I will not participate in administering this test. And ultimately, the administration had to say, okay, fine, we won't make you do it. Social workers, not a single social worker that I could see said, no, I'm not going to do this. Social workers were actually handing out draft notices in the camps. Wow. So think about that. So you were locked up because you're, by race disloyal. And then they institute a draft where if you were, and who is actually giving out information about and doing the investigation on who could be exempted from the draft? Social workers, and then actually handing out the draft notices. So yeah, I'm sorry, Mimi, but I actually never found example of this. It's possible. I did find people saying that they didn't want to go live in, the desert and in the bad weather.
I only, for what it's worth, in all of my work on the lawyers, I only found evidence of one who resigned in protest because he felt that he couldn't do what he was being asked to do. One would have hoped for more, but just one. I've got my eye on the clock, Jen and Kim, and so I wanted to just check in with you about how we're doing time-wise.
So I just want to, there's one question there, Eric, which I think might be a misinterpretation of one of the sort of slides at the end that kind of suggests that it was a beneficial process. And I think that we want to clarify who said that. And so if you just take a look at that question. And I would just say, for folks who haven't read the book, or social workers who haven't read the book, at least one of the things that you talk about in there about the passive avoidance of inattention to Asian American immigrants and by titans of our profession, including Grace Coyle and Edith Abbott, and who are, you know, for whom things are named now. To me, that's one of the parallels, and I absolutely affirm the sort of issue of sometimes as social workers, our ability to make things work and to try to make peace, I think keeps us from calling attention to untenable conditions, whether it's work in child welfare with unrealistic caseloads or racialized caseloads, or even, you know, mental health, let's treat trauma in 4 sessions kind of thing. So that's a huge, huge theme for us as a profession.
Yeah, I mean, and so the seeing this as seeing the whole experience as a benefit to the Japanese Americans was something that was actually the idea was really put out there by the War Relocation Authority as well as social workers. That, you know, we did a really great job of showing how democracy should work, and whether they liked it or not, ultimately now they're going to be more American and more integrated than they were before. So we did a good thing rather than a bad thing. It was actually something that I'm pointing out as a not only just revisionist, but it's just there's so much we could talk about the racism inherent in those ideas for days to come. But yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, there's so much that social work could protest. There's one set of teachers also in one of the camps who asked the administration if they could live in the same barracks as the inmates, meaning the Caucasians had much better lodging than the Japanese Americans, and they got fired for that, for being too close. And to, you know, and they were ridiculed. Actually, one of the persons ridiculing this was a lawyer in one of the camps who was actually outrageous about the whole thing. About, you know,
I'd be curious to know who that was. We can chat about that. Yeah, please do. So maybe we can. I don't. Again, I'm not sure where we're at on time, but there is a question here that might be seen as a nice capstone.
Let's do it.
Yeah, it's from Jacqueline Krapps, PhD, who asks, what are your thoughts on ways we can support our professional organizations today, NASW, APA, et cetera, in any work around policies relating to border camps and the need to protect the children and vulnerable others who are held there? What I understand the question to be asking is, you know, if we think about this as a kind of, you know, a failing of the profession back 75, 80 years ago, how can we take affirmative steps to bolster our professional organizations so that we don't make the same mistakes?
Okay, so I think it's a larger question than what do we do about bolstering these organizations. I think, so for me, one of the things is to study your history. You know, social welfare history is sadly dying. The new book I'm writing with a friend of mine, Michael Reich, who's another social welfare historian. But I swear to God, I look around and think we are the last 2 historians in social work. We no longer teach it. We no longer value it. And I don't understand how any discipline worth its name, without actually the ability to reflect on what it's done, can go forward, right? So I would say go back to doing some history and valuing it. And I mean, not for, you know, my sake, but because I'm doing it anyway. There's that. And then the other thing is we need to rethink of ourselves as somehow kinder and gentler than anybody else. Because that is, I think, a big Achilles heel. We sort of, social work tends to think of itself as being above the fray, and that, but it really needs to do some analysis of its current actions and past actions, because there is so much. Do you know that actually the NASW Code of Ethics does not use the word racism once? Not once. Neither does the Council on Social Work Education's its statement on how you're supposed to teach your classes, the EPAS it's called. That does not contain the word racism, not once.
Wow.
They need to be completely rewritten. And so we need to rethink these organizations, and we need to rethink our relationship to these organizations, and we need to rethink what these organizations do. But then, you know, we also then need to think about, what are we teaching? You know, where are the doctoral students who are going to then do history? And why would you actually, as a doctoral student, go and do history and look at these things and do critical work when you can't actually get a job doing it? So there's so much that needs to be re-examined here, that just looking at these, supporting our professional organizations, what we should be doing there is to challenge them, question them. You know, how is it that it's never made a statement? I mean, how can the NASW, National Association of Social Workers, put out a message saying, you know, if you're opposed to taking children away from these families, go and volunteer somewhere? I mean, how is that a response that we are actually accepting? So I guess my recommendation is to cause some trouble, people.
There you go.
Cause some good trouble. And that's what we're supposed to be doing, that we're not doing.
Yeah. That's wonderful.
My apologies for taking so long to get through the slides. It took much longer than I thought. So
I see Kim's mouth moving, but I do not hear Kim's voice talking. There you go.
Sure. Thank you, Eric Muller, for your work in this area and for your facilitation of this. Sun Park, a fabulous talk, and I think you primed us to think of many questions and connecting points that I hope will continue beyond today's conversation. We will save the questions for you because there may be some folks who want to communicate with you separately, and we'll make sure we share those if you don't have them. And also, again, thanks to folks at the School of Social Work and the Office of Ethics and Policy for help in putting this together. And thanks to everyone who attended. Our work is never done, but also the work requires work on ourselves. And this is really important continual message. So thank you so much, and good night, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.